I just want to find some wonderful, progressive, open-minded person in a housing association that's willing to let us build 2 hempcrete houses in a social housing scheme. That's all I want. That's my dream. If I can get that as my birthday present.
Hello everyone and welcome to FutureX, a podcast by Martin Hearn, Event Director at Futurebuild, and co-host Dr. Oliver Jones, Research Director at Ryder Architecture. FutureX will bring together some of the brightest minds and some of the most disruptive thinkers and innovators to transform the construction industry and build a FutureX community of like-minded people that can begin to make a real change. We really hope you enjoy the series.
Hello and welcome to another edition of FutureX. I'm Martin Hearn, Event Director at Futurebuild, and once again, really honoured to be joined by Dr. Oliver Jones of Ryder Architecture. Oliver, this week we've got another one of those sustainable pioneers, one of those people that have been doing it all the way through their career. And I know you've read the books, and I know you've got a lot of them around the Ryder offices as well.
We have. I'm a huge fan of Professor Tom Woolley and the work that he's been doing for decades, absolute decades, on healthy building materials. He's got an amazing book out on healthy building materials, and we'll have another one following very shortly, and on natural building techniques. And this guy is a total pioneer with regards to sustainable building, and specifically hempcrete. Really knowledgeable about the application of hempcrete. So we're going to talk to him. We're going to hear about some of the challenges that they've had with bringing it to the market, some of the benefits of using the product, and how we can maybe use it a bit more going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to pre-warn our listeners, this is a long one. Tom has a lot to say, and quite rightly so. So I think we delve straight in.
Absolutely. Hi, Tom. Thanks for joining us today.
Yes, good morning, Oliver. Good to see you.
It's absolutely fantastic to see you, mate. Martin and I have got an awful lot of things to cover with you today, and an awful lot of ground to cover, and probably comes from, as I've told you before, and I don't mean to embarrass you and put you on the spot, but clearly a sustainability veteran, Tom. Let's and active still.
Less of the veteran, please.
One of the things that we always kick off with, and I think it's even more important when speaking to someone who's got such a lengthy experience as yourself, is just tell us a little bit about yourself, Tom. Tell us a bit about your journey. Where did you go to university, and how did you get to where you are currently?
Yes, okay. Well, I went to study architecture at Edinburgh University, and that was during the 60s. So because the course at Edinburgh was so bad, it meant I didn't have to do very much work, unlike the poor students these days, and was able to run around doing all sorts of exciting things. Like I was student representative on the RIBA Council. We ran the British Architectural Students Association. We started doing what became known as community architecture. And by the time I got to final year, there were two of us who were kind of in a situation when nobody in the school would teach us. There was myself and Howard Liddell, who went on to found Gaia Architecture. And so we were lucky to find a wonderful man called Andrew Gilmore, who came in and went on to actually be head of the architecture school in Edinburgh. And he saved Howard and I from sort of probably never becoming architects. So I did my final year, was about the rehabilitation of tenement housing in North Merkiston in Edinburgh. And that was really because I felt that we needed to be focusing on what you did with existing buildings, whereas all my classmates were designing opera houses and airports and things like that for their final thesis. So that was a bit of a risk, but I was very lucky that Duccio Chirin was the external examiner, and I ended up coming out with a first. It was either a first or a fail. So from an early days, I took an alternative approach to architecture, and I've spent much of my life working on rehabilitation of buildings, because for me that's the most sustainable thing to do. But within the architectural profession, you're not really regarded as a proper architect if that's what you do. So, and then I was lucky enough in the cutting a very long story short, we set up a community architecture practice in London when I was teaching at the AA. That became part of the community technical aid movement. We then got funding to produce something called the Green Building Digest, and the ACTAC, the organization, got that funding, had no idea how to do it. We didn't really know what we were doing. So we set out doing the Green Building Digest, which then became the Green Building Handbook. And I still meet people who say, oh yes, we've got that on our shelves, you know, we still refer to it. So that was back in the 90s, and was basically a critique of conventional building construction methods. And I got to the point where I felt it was far too negative. You know, we have to produce alternatives. So that led to me producing a book called Natural Building. And I went around the country finding people who were building buildings out of earth and straw bales and so on. And that was also at the time when we just started to learn about hemp lime construction as well. So it's kind of journey through working on renovation to trying to find greener alternatives, and that's what I've been doing ever since, really. And I find it really disturbing in a way how poor the teaching and understanding of sustainability is within the architectural profession. I still run into situations in which architecture schools are not really teaching it, because I now do a bit of teaching on the Centre for Alternative Technology Part 2 course. And so we get students coming from other schools of architecture, and they're essentially refugees from the architectural education system, because they come to us at CAT and say, we did 3 years of architecture and nobody taught us anything about the environment at all. So that's why we've come to you, because we're desperate to learn that. But I find that very worrying in this day and age. People pay lip service to, you know, saving the planet, but they're not really doing much about it. So that's why I probably should shut up at that point. So you can ask me some other questions.
Tom, I find it really interesting because, you know, we've had a lot of the, you know, the style of this podcast, we had a lot of the sort of more activist groups on. We had ACAN and Net Zero and Zero Construct, and we've had Letty, you know, on as well. And, you know, a lot of what you're talking about, you know, and what you were doing in the early sort of 70s, 80s, 90s is sort of, you know, coming much more to the forefront now. Can you tell us about, you know, you're probably one of the original early activists. Sorry,
I'll just turn that. That's Will Stanix phoning me from South Carolina.
So get him on if you are.
Yeah, you ought to do a podcast with him, really. But he presumably has had to give up teaching people how to build with hempcrete in South Carolina because of the storm. So I don't know. Yeah. I don't know where he is at the moment. But anyway, I'll ring him back.
That's fine. No, so I was just saying, you know, there's a lot of positive activism going on in the architecture industry at the moment, but you know, you were on one of the forefront of that in the early 70s and 80s.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we didn't do a good job. I'm not sure, but I think that where people lost their way was there was far too much focus on energy efficiency alone, and not a holistic approach. And clearly, we perhaps didn't anticipate that fully, and we should have addressed it better. And sorry about this. It's the issue really is that if you focus purely on energy efficiency, then you don't consider things like embodied energy. You don't consider where the sourcing of the materials. You don't consider health issues and emissions from materials. You know, those sorts of things are left to one side. And so I think the parting of the ways really was when the BRE started producing the Green Guide to Specification, that was entirely based on how good materials were claimed to be to create energy efficient buildings. And whereas we tried to adopt a more holistic approach, which architects seem to find a good thing to do in the Green Building Handbook. And it was really the mainstream just went on to follow the BRE approach through BREEAM and so on, which focused narrowly on making buildings energy efficient and not looking at the other issues. Now, over time, that slowly changed, that people have recognized the importance of things like embodied energy. But I think we didn't do as good a job at tackling those issues that time, and that's left a sort of educational gap in a way, which we're now trying to, you know, do better with, and I think people are starting to come around to understanding the need for a more holistic approach. But where things also went wrong was that the Green Guide specification gave the top rating to petrochemical materials, like the materials that burned on Grenfell Tower. They got very high ratings, and natural bio-based low embodied energy materials got very poorly rated. And so architects have tended to follow that, and that's still the case. And I'm coming across examples now where planning authorities are requiring people putting in planning applications to comply with BREEAM, or even to comply with the Green Guide to Specification, with having not the slightest idea of what that actually means, and not really understanding what it's about. So we're still fighting a battle there against those sorts of problems.
We had Joe Giddins on recently, who's over at Built by Nature, and he was talking about, you know, their goal is the adoption of mass timber. And, you know, he's talking about the insurance issues, and you've mentioned there the planning issues as well. You know, do you find the same aspect in right across the base of natural building products? Yeah,
well, I think mass timbers are a really key issue at the moment, because they've really been hit badly by the new regulations about fire safety and so on, and the Building Safety Act and some of the new regulations that come in have actually been very damaging to bio-based materials, whether it's mass timber or other kind of forms of construction, and that's again, it's amazing how things come around in circles. So there was the infamous World in Action program about timber frame construction many years ago, which kind of showed how badly built timber frame buildings were being built at the time, and that put everybody off timber frame. And then gradually the timber frame industry has kind of rebuilt since then, and is better established now. But there is always this sort of ignorance, and the ignorance is promoted by people like the concrete industry, who are always our enemy in a sense, because cement and concrete is responsible for, you know, some of the most significant carbon emissions on the planet, but they still are promoting themselves as being so-called sustainable and low carbon, and that's a worry. And I think that, but as I say, the mass timber people, in a sense, because they have been more commercial and doing bigger buildings, if you like, the fact that they're struggling at the moment is a worry.
The issues that you mentioned there, Tom, around there are a lot around public perception, aren't they, and regulation and standards in the space. There's a lot of similarities there for me in previous conversations that we've had around a lot of your work with hemp. In terms of, I mean, do you want to tell us a little bit more about that and how you got into that space?
Yes, well, I think one of the things is that, for instance, we're still having to argue the case for hemp lime or hempcrete, and people assume have all sorts of fallacies about it, really. One of which I've had to battle with recently is that it would be flammable, whereas in fact it's totally not flammable at all. It's almost impossible to set fire to hempcrete, so it's incredibly fire safe material. But I'm not quite sure. I think I got interested in hempcrete at an AECB conference in London many years ago when Ralph Carpenter did a demonstration. He'd been over to France and learned about hempcrete from the French, and he did this wonderful talk and he demonstrated how you mix up hempcrete. And at the end of the session, everybody got out and walked out. Nobody asked him any questions, and he was standing there looking completely baffled. What have I said wrong? What's the issue? I was the only one who stayed on, so I said, "No, don't worry, Ralph. I'm here. I think this is wonderful. I'm going to go work with you on this. We've got to take this to the masses. You know, it's a fantastic thing." Ralph's a very, very good architect, very sweet guy. I mean, he's retired now, really, but he was really interested in using hempcrete with his local practice in Suffolk. He wasn't particularly wanting to run around and sell it to the world, but we set about promoting hempcrete. We produced a book which BRE Press published. Ralph contributed to that along with some other early pioneers of hempcrete, and that set a sort of standard for hemp lime construction, which we thought would grow very rapidly. There would be a big uptake, but it remains at what you could call a cottage industry level. It hasn't really taken off in the mainstream. So there are a few large buildings. I work with David Lee and Pat Bora on the Wise building at Cat, which is probably the biggest hempcrete building. We did a big project in Dublin called the Rediscovery Centre, which Dublin City Council approved the use of hempcrete without batting an eyelid. I mean, there wasn't a problem. And I'm still working with people around the country and traveling around to promote hempcrete. I'm off to run a workshop in Iceland in a few days' time. They're even growing hemp on the slopes of volcanoes in Iceland. So it's there, it's established, but I have a constant battle with a lot of the, what you say, greener architects who are completely wedded to using recycled cellulose, recycled newsprint insulation. They will not shift from that. They think it's wonderful, which I don't think it is, and I cannot persuade them to just try hempcrete. Just do it in one of your buildings. Why not just give it a little bit of a go? Oh, no, we do what we do, and we do what we've been doing for 20 years, and we're not going to change. And people are very, I don't know, they're very resistant within the construction industry to trying out new things.
I agree, Tom. What do you think's holding hemp back? Because, you know, you talk there about, there's obviously still massive misperceptions around its performance. You know, you talked about the fire aspects of it. You know, as a sort of a material that's been around for centuries. What's holding it back in its mass adoption?
Well, I think that there's still a lot of people campaigning for greener buildings and more energy efficiency are still convinced that we should continue to use petrochemical based materials. And the bulk of the literature and the standards and the practice of many organizations continues to make excuses about why it's okay to use flammable, toxic, nasty, horrible stuff, which is most of the base materials being made in China by slave labor, and is doing huge damage to the planet. They still are happy to continue to use that. And then they have lots of excuses. So they say, well, we can't use hemp because if you're growing enough hemp to build all the buildings, then there wouldn't be any land left for food, which is nonsense because hemp is actually a food crop and it is a very good part of an agricultural system. They say there's no supply chain. well, there is a actually reasonably good supply chain. I mean, if somebody comes to us to do a hempcrete building tomorrow, we can get the materials without any difficulty. Then they say it's too expensive, whereas it actually isn't too expensive. It's potentially now cheaper than mainstream materials. So they have lots of excuses, and in a way, I'm the wrong person to ask that question, because I just simply, I don't understand what the problem is. And I'm probably, if they see me coming, oh my God, they're not Tom Woolley, he's going to shove hemp down our throat again. So, it's kind of, I'm not necessarily the right person. I mean, it's interesting that Will Stanix from the Hemp Block Company's just trying to phone me at the moment, where he's got set up a commercial company, trying to promote hempcrete construction, and they're great people, but they're not making huge progress, I don't think, in terms of getting it into the industry. There is the issue of certification as well. I mean, that's so some of the organizations I talk to, you feel as though they actually want to build the buildings out of certificates, and rather than actual building materials. They're completely obsessed with the idea. But we've gone through the certification process. It's just that it's chicken and egg. If you can't build the industry enough to be bigger, then it's going to be difficult to fund all the expensive approvals processes. So, you sort of go around in circles. But also, though, it's clear that the mainstream is sniffing around hemp and hempcrete now. So we know that some of the bigger commercial companies, I'm not going to mention specific names, but we know that they're looking at it. And for instance, one of the biggest builders merchants, he has now taken over, or has taken some commercial interest in one of the French hemp lime things. So that's starting to happen now. But often their motives are all about just making money. They're not really interested in the environmental benefits.
For some of our listeners who may not be familiar with some of the fantastic benefits of using hemp, Tom, do you think you could just summarize what an amazing building material it actually is?
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, I suppose the great thing about hemp lime is it's incredibly flexible material, so you can use it in so many different ways. So we've just finished a house in Galloway in Scotland, which is built as a timber frame house. It's partly post and beam, and then it has a timber subframe. We then got a specialist contractor to come and spray hempcrete into the walls of that building. So the hempcrete is the walls are about 350 mil thick. They consist entirely of hemp lime, nothing else apart from the timber frame. There's no plastic membranes, there's no sticky tape, there's no sheathing boards. It's all done. The whole wall is done with hempcrete. On the most exposed gable end of the building, we've got a timber rain screen to give a bit of added protection, but the rest of the thing, there's a lime render on the outside of the hemp lime, and we know that gives fantastic weather protection. So we can achieve very high levels of thermal performance using just 350 mil hempcrete. The house will need very little heating. It stores the heat, it has thermal mass, but it also has thermal capacity. It's not just thermal mass like concrete, but it has this ability to give the heat back into the building in a way which the concrete, which has thermal mass, doesn't do. It's hygroscopic, so it's able to, and it's breathable, vapor permeable, so it's able to deal with moisture and water. So if it gets at all, if there's high levels of moisture or humidity, you do not get any problem with condensation. And we've just had a study done by University of Ulster of one of our hempcrete buildings, which shows that the relative humidity stays at 50% all year round without any change, whatever's happening, whether there's people in the building or not in the building, whatever the humidity is outside, which can be very high in Northern Ireland, it stays the same. So it's the most amazing material for regulating conditions and creating thermal comfort. And because I've been involved in buildings and for all my life, I've never come across a material that works as effectively. There's nothing else that really compares. Even many of the other bio-based materials like wood fiber, straw bale, and sheep's wool, all of which have positive sides to them, but they're just not as good as hempcrete. And it's the only way we can really get people to convert, in a sense, convert to it is they have to experience it. They have to spend some time in a building that's built with it, and then suddenly they realize how amazing it is.
I was going to say that, you know, your experience with these kinds of materials, you know, I've an avid reader of your books, and you've moved into a space of sort of evidence base, building an evidence base, I suppose is the best way to put it, for internal air quality and the internal environment quality that these materials can offer, which I think is a lot more powerful in terms of its argument than a lot of these green companies that are out there just saying, "No, this is a bio-based material. It's green. Let's get it in the building." You know, you seem to be really invested, Tom, in building that evidence base, and particularly focusing on healthy buildings. Do you want to tell us a bit about your work around healthy buildings?
Yes, well, I became aware of the issue of indoor air quality a few years ago, and I think, like most architects, I hadn't really given it much thought. Prior to that, it just seemed to me that there was an issue to do with healthy buildings. There was a lot of discussion a few years ago about sick building syndrome, and people sort of picked up on that. That's even ordinary people have heard of sick building syndrome without really knowing what it is, and then it sort of disappeared for a while. And in fact, I think a lot of big commercial, like office buildings and things like that, the M&E engineers know how to ventilate and manage the buildings much better these days than they did in the past. So it's less of a problem there, but it's much more of a problem in, you know, houses and smaller buildings. So recently I've been in contact with some medical researchers in Finland, where they are doing work on mold growth in buildings. And they were telling us that there are 3 recently built schools in Finland that have actually been closed because of mold and damp issues. So here we are, you know, these days we're building modern buildings that are highly energy efficient, and we still don't know how to prevent mold and condensation in the buildings. I mean, and I think if you look at the whole issue of building physics, which is closely related to air quality and healthy buildings, there isn't really a proper department of building physics in any university in the UK. It's a Cinderella subject. There are some really good people out there who are doing research on this, but they're not. There isn't really a centre of excellence looking at building physics, and so a lot of and there's very little post-occupancy evaluation work being done, so people don't really understand why problems have occurred. So I'm working, supporting various people. There's a wonderful woman in Scotland who has got set up a company called Beyond Healthy Homes, and she's getting masses of work, people contacting her because they've got health problems. And ordinary members of the public have realized that there might be an explanation for their health problems that's due to the buildings that they're in. So she's going around, and she recently went to look at a new development in Edinburgh, where the buildings are designed very, very high standards of energy efficiency. And they have got severe mold growth in the building on the underside of the insulation in the roof, which is not a cold surface, but they've got high levels of mold growth. And that's before anybody's moved into the building. So their solution is to spray the building with fungicide to try and kill the mold growth. Because in fact, if they're going to really solve the problem, they'd have to rip out, hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of materials. And they have a condensation risk analysis that tells them that there won't be a problem. And yet there is this massive amount of mold growth. So mold is one thing, but then you've got the emissions from the chemicals which are used in many modern building materials. So for instance, one of the things I'm doing research on at the moment is the widespread use of so-called intelligent or breather membranes to create air tightness in buildings. And I've only recently been able to find data about the levels of flame retardants that are used in these plastic materials. And architects specify these membranes without thinking twice about it, but actually the flame retardants are extremely dangerous. They're carcinogenic. They can be absorbed by the people, particularly women. Pregnant women are particularly vulnerable. We now have a really good little research group of scientists and architects and other people around the country who are looking into the sort of risks and trying to build up the data and evidence about the health problems which come from modern materials. So you've got higher levels of problem, you've got higher levels of cancer, you've got higher levels of asthma, you've got respiratory problems and so on. Many of those can be traced back to the ways in which we build our buildings.
I guess what you're advocating here with hempcrete is, if we go simpler, there's an awful lot more benefit in employing that technology, because it's breathable, because it regulates that internal environment so well. But just while you're talking there, Tom, around these challenges that you find, I find it fascinating that you see a problem like air quality and you say, right, I'm going to go and have a go at fixing this. I need to pull a group of people together. How do you do that? What's the mechanism for you just saying, do you know what, this is an issue, we're going to try and solve it? What does that actually look like logistically when you try and pull that group together?
Well, of course, we've got the internet these days, which is a huge, if you can imagine when we were doing the research on the Green Building Digest, I mean, we one of the things we did when we did the Green Building Digest on adhesives, we literally went round a big, I won't mention the name of the company, big super, store selling building materials, taking the cans of adhesive off the shelves and photographing what it said about the data on the back of the tin, much to the annoyance of the people in the shop, because and that was it was almost impossible in those days to track down. Now you can look up health and safety data sheets, but you have to be, I guess there's something about me that's made, I've always maybe fancied being a bit of a detective, really, and I love pursuing things and trying to outwit the companies, because, for instance, a lot of the health and safety, the COSH sheets that you can get now on building materials, the companies have been very clever at hiding information on them. And then I discovered that in Canada and Australia, they still have the old-fashioned health and safety data sheets, but often it's for the same product. So you can actually get much more detail about the chemicals in the product by looking up the Australian and Canadian ones than you can if you look at the UK ones. But it's partly because of the internet. But then I started to discover that there were people all over the world doing amazing research on this, and so you can get in touch with people like that, and you can chat with them on Zoom, and you can find out what they've been doing. And I've just come back from Berlin, where I went to the Nature Plus conference. Nature Plus is a certification system for ecological materials, which is fantastic. It's sort of gold standard really for materials. But I also went to see the scientists at the Umweltbundesamt, which is the German Environment Agency, and they're experts on indoor air quality and pollution and so on. And so I just so lucky that they were willing to spend the morning talking to me and telling me about what was going on, because they're struggling at the moment to get proper indoor air quality regulation into even European regulations like the construction product regulations and so on. They're on a bit of a losing battle at the moment on that. So, but the knowledge is out there, but it's just, you have to try, you've got to search for it, So my sort of interest in being a detective has come to the fore with that, and I find it a real challenge. And I hope nobody from Routledge is going to listen to this, because they are really cheesed off with me, because I'm meant to be doing volume 2 of my building materials book, and all I've done is accumulate vast amount of material in a completely hopeless way, doing exactly what I tell my students not to do. And so somehow I've got to go and shut myself away from the world for 6 months and sift through it, really.
Well, I'm sure once you return from Iceland, there might be an opportunity over the dock. And currently, what appears like it's going to be a very cold winter. You've just come back from Margent Farm as well, haven't you?
Yes, there was a wonderful conference on Wednesday organised by a startup company called Hemspan. And Hemspan are producing a series of hemp insulation products, unfortunately currently manufactured somewhere in Europe, not in the UK. But I was very pleased to hear that they've changed their pricing structure now. So they're now going to be able to sell this really lovely hemp quilt insulation. So they ran this conference, but interestingly, while the CEO of Hemspan spoke at the conference, they also invited people to talk about other uses of hemp. So they got Graham Durant from Hemp Lime Spray speaking at it. And then they had Jeremy Blake, who's an architect who's done a lot of hempcrete buildings. So they actually covered the whole span of different sort of hemp-based materials. But also it was great to actually be in a real natural, innovative building, which Margent Farm is. It's very well publicized, so people will be familiar with it, I think. But quite often I get invited to speak at conferences, even ones on indoor air quality, in which they hold them in the most unhealthy, unsustainable, horrible buildings you can possibly imagine. There's going to be a big one in Birmingham next year, and they've already decided to hold it in a horrible sort of air-conditioned hotel. And I've been saying to them, why don't you hold this event in a healthy building, for goodness sake,
Mm-hmm.
So it was lovely, and it was the sunshine as well, so it was solar gain, and it's just we were able to go and walk into a field where there was still some hemp left that hadn't been harvested. So it was quite a boost, actually. And they're going to have to run the event again, because I think there were about 100 people there, but they had another 200 people wanted to come to it. So, wow. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice here, but.
So, Tom, Martin and I were chatting the other day, particularly about the use of hemp, and you've touched on it a little bit here in terms of the scalability. And a lot of these projects tend to be smaller scale, or in terms of getting them off the ground. Are there scalability issues in terms of building size with hemp?
No, not at all. So there's a 12-story hempcrete building being built in Cape Town at the moment.
Amazing.
So that a company has been set up, Afrimat has set up to make hempcrete blocks. So you can spray hempcrete, you can cast it, you can use it in blocks, you can do prefabricated panels like they did at Margent Farm. So you can use it in different ways. In this case, I think it's a renovation of an existing building which has been gutted, but they've been able to retain the existing main structural frame of the building, but then all the walls will be made out of hempcrete. And that's go up to 12 stories, and there are 8-story hempcrete buildings in Paris, for instance. You know, the building we did in Dublin, the Rediscovery Centre, that had about 100 cubic meters of hempcrete in it. So, you know, there actually isn't a problem with scaling it.
So, but both Martin and I don't know, ask you a follow-on question, but I just want to cheekily try and squeeze mine in there. When you talked earlier about the wall buildup not needing all of the additional elements to it and the additional components, surely there's a cost saving there.
Yes, I mean, I think buildings are often far too complex now. Even simple timber frame construction can have up to sort of 15 layers of materials, all of which have to be put together, and they have to be done really carefully, which the building industry isn't always very good at. And they also need fire stopping as well. So, you know, it's quite complex, and that's inevitably going to be more expensive than just casting a material that does the whole wall in one go. People say, "Oh, hempcrete's very labor intensive," but actually, you know, it's not that labor intensive, and it is potentially affordable. I mean, it is price competitive with conventional construction now. There's no doubt about that.
We might be at a real tipping point with it as well, with hemp oil in particular becoming extremely, you know, fashionable at the moment. You know, in the various CBD products, there must be production in the UK must be ramping up. So this one of what goes into hempcrete being a byproduct of that.
Correct. So the problem is that the farmers are still not allowed to harvest the leaves and the flowers. So they're under constant scrutiny from the government, and hemp crops are constantly being destroyed by the government because they claim that they haven't followed the regulations. So if the regulations were changed so that farmers could get the full financial benefit from hemp, then the whole thing would go completely bonkers. People would be doing it everywhere. The farmers desperately want to do it. Most of the CBD oils and things that you buy in shops now are manufactured overseas. A lot of them are quite dodgy products that when they're tested, they find that it's just fake. So if we set up a proper industry in the UK, and there are people campaigning and working very hard for this, and as you say, if that takes off as an industry, then we'll have unlimited supplies of hemp shiv, which we use for building. That's and there would be plenty of hemp fiber as well, which could go into insulation products. It's a no-brainer in a way, and it's really held back by some stupid politicians and officials who are still completely worried about marijuana and the idea that it's going to be somehow everyone in the country is going to go out and start smoking spliffs. You know, if we grow more, it's just silly, really.
Yeah. Tom, in your book, you've talked about that, you know, the natural building products, you know, it needs to go beyond just sort of the grand designs, the cabins in the countryside, and actually be that main scale schools, hospitals, you know, even in the refurb market as well. Do we have the skills in the UK to be able to do that? We talk a lot about the skills gap in construction. And there's a perception, I think probably wrongly, that, you know, this is a sort of a very much artisan cottage industry, the natural building products. But how can you see this scaling?
Well, one of the great things about hempcrete is I say I can train any builder how to use it in a morning. It's so simple and easy to do. There are a few colleges now starting to change the agenda slightly in terms of training, but to move towards net zero and zero carbon. But what they're actually doing is they're teaching the students how to do incredibly complicated wall build-ups with flammable insulation materials, and they're not teaching them how to use natural materials. There are one or two exceptions, but we still have quite a struggle on there to get the people being trained. But the wonderful thing about hempcrete is it's just so easy and simple. It's one of the reasons why I've not made a lot of money out of it over the years, because we decided to make it open source. The university was furious with me when we first started doing this for not taking out patents, but I said no, it's just so simple, anybody can do it. And the problem is getting people to use the right materials, and not because once they do that, really anybody, any self-builder can do it. It's so easy to train people what's involved in hempcrete, and we are starting to see a number of companies developing. So I mean, I've been working with some people in South Wales. It's a company called Wellspring Homes, and they are going to be building 8 hempcrete houses in Neath, near Swansea. They've built a trial house in my state, which has been sold now with a mortgage from Nationwide Building Society. They didn't bat an eyelid about it, and but I mean, they've had the same problems I have. They've gone around all the housing associations, all the public sector bodies, and said, look, we can build these wonderful houses. Come and have a look at the one we've done. Not interested. No, won't even consider it. There's a kind of stupidity there. I spent a lot of time recently in Margent Farm with a guy who's trying to set up a development company in Cornwall, doing hempcrete houses and so on, and he has spent a lot of time talking to mainstream public sector bodies there. He's confident that he's going to convert them, but there's no solid evidence of it yet. So we're still and we need to get more of this into mainstream construction exhibitions and shows and conferences. There's still a lot of work to be done with that.
With you, and you've talked a lot about education. I suppose if you're an architect that's listening to this podcast at the moment, and other than obviously reading your books, where do what's the resources we should point them to? Where do they start in this journey?
Yes, I mean, one of the slight dangers of something like Hemp Lime is it's taking off internationally at a phenomenal rate. So the Americans are now doing. I've just been sent a booklet about hemp construction in America, and I mean, but there are great dangers on looking on the internet and being a Google builder. There's a lot of misinformation out there. So, I mean, the main thing really is to go to someone like myself. I've got 4 training workshops coming up at the moment, so we can train. We're doing one in County Mayo in Ireland, and one in Dublin. I'm doing this one in Iceland, which probably isn't very accessible to people in the UK. And I met someone at Margent Farm wants me to go and do one in the Bristol area. So, but other companies, there's the Hemp Block Company, there's Hempcrete Cymru, there's Wellspring Homes. There's a number of people now doing this around the country, and if anybody wants to find out about it, they can contact those people, and they will show them how to do it. And as I say, because it's so easy, it doesn't take a lot of time. You can learn how to do hempcrete in less than a day. Normally we run a workshop, would take a day. We'd do half a day would be presentations, and then the other half would be hands-on using the materials.
Tom, I guess it's a good point there to plug your latest tome of Natural Building Techniques: A Guide to Ecological Methods and Materials. Is that through Routledge? Should I have mentioned that?
No, it's published by a lovely little publishing company in Wiltshire called Crowwood Press, and they actually do lots of books on building. They've done a whole lot of. They've done Phil Jones's book recently on energy issues in building and so on. So they're a nice little publishing company to go to. Lovely to work with. We deliberately set out to make the book as cheap as possible, which means that from an architect's point of view, there aren't huge, great pictures in it. Most of the pictures are quite small, but I've tried to make it as well referenced as possible. And I've tried to include information, but it's at a fairly superficial level. So if somebody wants technical details about hempcrete or straw bale construction or earth building, you'll not get that in the book. The idea is to introduce people to what the benefits are of these materials and to show examples of projects.
Yeah, it's absolutely excellent. I mean, I've read it, and we've got quite a few copies spread throughout the practice to introduce people to these natural building techniques, and indeed we're sort of we'll await your volume 2 of your natural building materials as well.
Healthy building materials book. Well, they actually, the first one of the building materials and health book has actually sold a lot more copies than Routledge ever imagined it would. So it's done very well. And the natural building technique book is selling like hotcakes. I mean, I'm having to order in another 10 or 15 copies every couple of weeks, because as soon as I've got them, people, I mean, we didn't have enough at Margent Farm. Poor old Luli, who was organising the conference, had got 10 copies there, and the 10 copies disappeared in about 2 minutes, and people were really furious because there weren't any more there. So I think the appetite is there. I think people really are interested now. You know, we've got the right moment, but we're still struggling with government and the funding bodies, Innovate UK, all these sorts of organisations that I have contact with, but they're just not interested. They cannot see it. They don't understand it, and they're still promoting the use of petrochemical and plastic materials. And someday the penny's going to drop. They're going to get it, but it's tough. It's tough.
It fits with, from everything you said, Tom. I mean, you've already converted me in the past, but it's such a compelling argument. It's such a compelling evidence base, and it fits in topically. It's so timely with a drive towards circular construction and reinforcing the circular economy. All of the things that we've talked about around the other elements of the industry. As you say, it's an absolute no-brainer. So what do we need to see from, what do you think we need to see from government, and what do you think we need to see from the research funding bodies who might not want to fund it because it is so simple? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things on my long list to do, and I've got some offer of help, is I'm chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Forum on Carbon Monoxide, and the people who organise those meetings and support that have given me some advice about how we could set up an all-party parliamentary group on bio-based construction materials. So I'm hoping to do that. There are some MPs and members of the House of Lords who understand these issues and are interested, and I've spoken to some of them. And so I think that might be a way forward, because an all-party parliamentary group doesn't have any power within Parliament, but it does have the ability to invite civil servants and people to come along and explain to them why they're not, so we get people from Bayes and DEFRA and so on who could come along and say, well, we think this is a good idea, we're just not really doing anything about it at the moment, and that should move the agenda on, hopefully.
I think we would super interested in that area, Tom. We're compiling a bio-based materials database at the moment with some of our colleagues in Sydney and the Deep Green Biotech Hub over there. So I've been meaning to get back in touch with you about that and talk to you about that a bit more. So there's a huge groundswell, and it's a really, really exciting area. Very aware that we're taking up even more of your time here, Tom. So yeah. I just want to throw one last question out to you. we ask all of our guests, what is your absolute vision, your desire for the vision of the future to be? But, what do you want from the future?
Well, it's quite sort of modest, really. I just want to find some wonderful, progressive, open-minded person in a housing association that's willing to let us build 2 hempcrete houses in a social housing scheme. That's all I want. That's my dream. If I can get that as my birthday present, then that's just going to make life. And it's just and if we could do it, we could even do it with a couple of houses built out of some horrible petrochemical materials, and we can then demonstrate with post-occupancy evaluation how the hempcrete houses will be doing much better. So that's all I want. It's quite a modest dream, really. It shouldn't be that difficult to do. Good. Thank you very much indeed. That's good. Okay.
Well, Martin, plenty to think about from Tom there, and wow, did we cover a lot of ground? As you said, a bit of a long one, but wow, definitely well worth it. Tom's going to be at the show, isn't he?
He is. We're really honoured actually to have Tom at Futurebuild in March. He's going to do 2 sessions for us. One is, and you've probably seen from today, he's got so much to talk about. So we're giving him his own entire masterclass session on our materials stage. So you'll have 45 minutes of Tom, all things hempcrete, I imagine, which is going to be phenomenal. And then when he's putting on his other hat, he's going to do a session on indoor air pollution in buildings and why it matters as well on our interiors stage. So he's bringing Professor Sir Stephen Holgate, who's the UK Clean Air Champion and author of the Royal College of Paramedics and Child Health Report on the health effects of indoor air quality. Bit of a mouthful there. And also Dr. Michelle Bellington at Glasgow University, who's author of the Royal College of Obstetricians report on the chemical exposures during pregnancy. So bit of a hard-hitting session there, but some really good content.
Totally worth it. And wow, is it topical? I mean, out of indoor air quality, we just need to get this sorted. And Tom is the international expert on this. So let's get down to Futurebuild and make sure that we check him out.
But he's a detective, isn't he, from our last talk? So
certainly is. He certainly is. All right, guys. Well, I love that.
Lovely. And once again, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please like, share, and most importantly, subscribe.
Join our community to stay up to date with all things FutureX. Visit futurebuild.co.uk to sign up. Please also like them and share them to help grow our community. You can subscribe to the podcasts within your favourite podcast platform. Thanks so much for listening, and we hope you'll be back again soon.